Imagine an engine just revving at like 8,000 RPMs.
Wow, that's running hot.
Right. It is just burning through premium fuel at an astonishing rate.
Yeah.
The heat coming off the block is intense, and the noise is, I mean, it's absolutely deafening.
Yeah.
And if you're just standing nearby, listening to that roar, you would assume that vehicle is flying down the highway at 100 miles an hour.
You'd think it's breaking speed records, yeah.
Exactly. But then the smoke clears, and you look down, and you realize the car is sitting on cinder blocks.
Oh, man.
It hasn't moved a single inch in 5 years.
Right. It's just noise.
Just noise. And that sensory illusion where we look at the sheer volume of heat and noise and mistake it for actual forward momentum, that is the exact state of most modern organizations today.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, we look at a packed calendar, we look at a depleted budget, we see emails flying at 2 in the morning, and we point to all that exhausting friction and say, like, look at us, we're succeeding.
Which is a terrifying metric for success when you realize that friction eventually just destroys the engine.
Right. It melts down.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Because, we are culturally conditioned to demand visibility. We want our impact to be quantifiable by the sheer volume of our activity.
Mm-hmm.
If the team is exhausted, the assumption is, well, the team must be doing something profoundly important.
Yeah. If you're tired, you're working hard. That's the mindset.
Exactly. But we rarely stop to measure if all that activity is actually moving the needle or if we are just, digging a deeper rut in the dirt.
Yeah, and that gap, that massive, exhausting void between being incredibly busy and actually being effective, that is what we are decoding in this deep dive today.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. So today we are immersing ourselves in a piece of source material that fundamentally dismantles how we think about organizational activity, purpose, and burnout, frankly.
That's a monumental text.
Literally monumental. The text is called Missions Ministry Mapping, Aligning Identity, Strategy, and Sustainability in God's Kingdom.
A long title, but it hits every point.
It does. And the author is Chris R. Velasquez. And look, we are looking at a 3,628-page digital manual here.
It's massive.
Published in 2026 by Living Word Publishing. And, you do not just skim a document of this magnitude. You practically have to move into it and study the architecture.
Yeah, calling it an architectural masterwork is probably the best way to frame it.
Yeah.
Because it's entirely built on field-tested reality.
Right. This isn't just theory.
No, not at all. Velasquez is bringing over 25 years of experience as a missionary pastor in the Philippines. So we're not dealing with a sterile academic white paper drafted by a consultant who has, never left an air-conditioned office.
Yeah, like some guy with a whiteboard in Silicon Valley.
Exactly. He is combining decades of serious on-the-ground grit and navigating poverty, planting churches, mobilizing skeptical communities, dealing with typhoons and political shifts.
Real-world chaos.
Real-world chaos, combined with incredibly high-level theological strategy. He has seen firsthand what happens when well-meaning people bring a massive amount of energy to a problem, only to watch their efforts completely unravel because they lacked a cohesive blueprint.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the core tension of this entire 3,000-plus page text is the absolute danger of motion without mission.
Yes, that's the perfect phrase for it.
And Velasquez argues that modern organizations, and he looks specifically at churches here, they suffer from a profound and often fatal confusion. They mistake visibility for vitality.
Right. They think busy equals alive.
Exactly. They believe that a calendar packed to the brim with committee meetings, community outreach programs, and brand new initiatives is undeniable proof of institutional health.
And he hits this concept relentlessly in the opening chapters. Activity by itself is not mission.
Right.
I mean, an organization could be a complete hive of constant motion, generating incredible amounts of data and volunteer hours, and yet still be structurally weak, spiritually shallow, and entirely fragmented.
Just spinning their tires on the cinder blocks.
Exactly. And Velasquez roots this critique in a deeply theological perspective. He leans heavily on Psalm 127, verse 1, which says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain."
Okay, so a very ancient concept here.
Yeah, and to understand the weight of that in its ancient Near Eastern context, building a house wasn't just about putting up walls and a roof.
Right.
It meant establishing a lineage, a dynasty, a lasting legacy. So Velasquez uses this to show that human activity, no matter how enthusiastic, no matter how well-funded, if it's untethered from divine direction, It simply becomes inefficient.
Wow.
It becomes an exhausting performance.
But wait, let me push back on that a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
If you are looking at a community with massive poverty or systemic issues, or even just looking at the chaotic landscape of your own neighborhood, I mean, isn't doing something always better than doing nothing?
It feels that way, yeah.
Right, because if I see a problem, my instinct is to jump in and start fixing it. How does a group of really well-meaning, big-hearted people end up so busy but so incredibly ineffective? If their motives are good, shouldn't the outcome be good?
You'd think so, right? But Velasquez diagnoses that instinct perfectly. What's fascinating here is he calls it the moment when effort outruns discernment.
Effort outruns discernment. That is sharp.
It really is. When leaders look at the sheer scale of need in the world, or even just the demands of their local community, the natural biological human reaction is anxiety.
Oh, totally. You feel overwhelmed.
Right. We feel this crushing pressure to respond immediately,
Yeah.
to prove our relevance, to show the board or the congregation that we are, handling it.
Yeah, like we have to do something right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what do well-meaning groups do? They adopt popular programs because they look good on an annual report.
Right?
They imitate successful models from other cities, assuming it's a simple plug-and-play solution. They launch 50 different initiatives purely out of a panicked desire to be seen doing something.
So they are basically managing their own anxiety by filling up the calendar.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with solving the problem. It's about self-soothing.
It is entirely reactionary.
Hmm.
And when you build a ministry, a business, or even just your life schedule out of anxiety and imitation, you create a scattered, fragmented culture.
Wow.
You end up with 20 different departments, pulling your finite resources in 20 different directions with absolutely no unifying core.
And the engine melts down.
Exactly.
Mhm.
The volunteers burn out, the budget bleeds dry, and the actual foundational problems in the community remain completely untouched.
So if our frantic activity is just us spinning our tires in the mud and occasionally throwing mud all over the people we're actually trying to help, we really have to stop the car and ask the most fundamental question.
Right.
Who is actually driving? Like, who owns this operation? And that takes us into the book's foundational concept. Before we can start drawing up strategic maps, we have to recognize who holds the compass.
Yeah, and this is where Velasquez introduces the theological concept of the Missio Dei.
Missio Dei.
Right. It's a Latin term that translates to the mission of God.
Okay.
And the book argues forcefully that mission is not a strategy the church invented.
Oh, interesting.
Right. It's not an outreach program brainstormed in a corporate boardroom with a whiteboard and sticky notes. Mission is a divine movement. The church does not generate the mission. It's invited to participate in a mission that has been actively running since the dawn of creation.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if we think about the Missio Dei, this pre-existing eternal mission of God, it fundamentally changes the physics of our work.
It totally shifts the paradigm.
Right. Like, imagine standing on the bank of a massive rushing river.
Okay, Mati.
For a lot of organizations, their entire strategy consists of standing on the dry riverbank with little plastic buckets, throwing water onto the dirt, desperately trying to manufacture a current all by themselves.
Oh, man. That sounds exhausting.
It is. They're sweating. They're exhausted. They're begging for more donations to buy bigger buckets. But Velasquez is pointing out that the river is already there. The current is already moving with massive force. Your job isn't to generate the water pressure.
No, your job is to build a boat, get in, and figure out how to navigate the waters that are already flowing.
Exactly.
And that shift in perspective completely relieves the organizational burden of invention. You do not have to invent the purpose of your church or your life.
That is so freeing.
It really is. You just have to discover where God is already moving and align your resources to that movement. And Velasquez walks the reader through a massive biblical arc to demonstrate this.
Yeah, he goes way back, right?
He does. He refuses to start the concept of mission in the New Testament. He takes us all the way back to Genesis 12, when God calls Abram and declares that through him, all the families of the earth will be blessed.
Which is usually taught as just a localized historical moment about one guy in the desert.
Right, just a neat story about Abraham. But Velasquez frames it as the opening of a global redemptive arc. God initiated the rescue operation.
River started flowing.
Exactly. And that arc runs continuously through the prophets, through the entire history of Israel, all the way to Jesus giving the Great Commission in Matthew 28, saying, go therefore and make disciples of all nations.
Right.
The Great Commission wasn't a brand new marketing strategy Jesus thought up on a mountain. It was the climactic, earthly expression of God's eternal, pre-existing purpose.
And if you look at how Jesus actually operated within that Missio Dei, it is completely scandalous to our modern sensibilities.
Oh, absolutely.
He did not move according to public pressure. He didn't bow to human expectations or the modern corporate obsession with endless quarter-over-quarter growth.
No, he actively resisted it.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus was constantly surrounded by desperate crowds, demanding miracle, demanding a spectacle, wanting to forcefully make him a political king to solve their immediate geopolitical problems.
Right, they wanted him to fix everything right then.
And his response, repeatedly, was to withdraw.
Yeah.
He would heal a massive crowd. The momentum would be at its absolute peak, the exact moment a modern organization would launch a capital campaign.
Yes! Time to pass the plate.
Exactly. And Jesus would just walk away into the wilderness to pray. He chose obedience to the Father's timeline over immediate, measurable popularity. He didn't heal every single person in the region. He didn't preach in every single town.
Which is wild to think about, because if a CEO or a pastor today walked away from a crowd of 5,000 people who were ready to sign up for their program, we would call them incompetent.
You'd say they're ruining the brand.
Exactly. We would say they're throwing away an opportunity. But Jesus was operating with perfect alignment. He wasn't distracted by the good at the expense of the mandated.
Right.
But that leaves us with a huge practical dilemma here.
Oh, for sure.
If the mission already exists and it belongs to God, how does a specific local group of people figure out their unique role in it? Like, if I am running a local nonprofit or a church in a specific town, how do I know where my specific boat is supposed to go on that massive river?
Well, Velazquez argues that to figure out your outward external role, you must first do the grueling work of looking inward.
Okay.
Before an organization can ever ask, what should we do, they must answer the far more difficult question, who are we?
Who are we?
Right? This is what he calls the architecture of mission. It is the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of establishing identity before strategy.
Which is the exact opposite of how almost every organization operates.
100% backward.
Because if you get a group of driven people in a room to start a new project, the very first thing they do is pull out a spreadsheet and ask, what are our tactics? What are we going to build? What is our timeline?
Let's get to work.
Right. And Velazquez is throwing a massive red flag on the field and saying, no, you are starting at the finish line. Identity must precede strategy.
And he roots this identity deeply in Scripture. He cites 1 Peter 2.9, which describes the church as a royal priesthood and a holy nation.
Right, not exactly corporate terminology.
No, not at all. And Velazquez spends a significant amount of time clarifying what the church is not, because that is where the identity drift happens.
Okay, what do you mean by identity drift?
Well, he states the church is not a nonprofit service provider.
Yeah.
It's not a corporate brand trying to capture demographic market share. It is not a social club for self-improvement.
Wow.
It is a covenant people called out to proclaim the excellencies of God. If a leadership team forgets that specific identity, if they let it drift into a generic humanitarian secularism, they will inevitably misread what they're actually called to do in their city.
It is the equivalent of trying to build a custom home by running to the hardware store and buying the most beautiful, expensive mahogany doors and these incredible imported stained glass windows, and you just start standing them up in the dirt.
Yeah, just propping them up in the mud.
Right. You are thrilled about the strategy, you love the features, but you haven't poured a concrete foundation yet. You have no structural architecture. You just have a pile of really expensive, well-meaning parts that are going to sink into the mud the moment it rains.
That's a great image for it.
In the corporate world, we call this scope creep. You start taking on all these peripheral side projects because they seem momentarily profitable or popular, and 5 years later, your company has completely forgotten what its core product even is.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Velazquez introduces a concept here that completely redefines that problem. He calls it theology as architecture.
Theology as architecture.
It is a brilliant framework. He argues that a thin theology inevitably produces a thin mission.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, we often treat theology as if it's just academic trivia for a seminary exam, completely disconnected from the real world.
Right, like something you just debate in a classroom.
Exactly. But Velazquez argues that theology is the invisible, load-bearing framework that dictates exactly how you treat human beings when they walk through your doors.
But how does a highly abstract academic belief actually change the practical hands-on work? I mean, if someone comes to you needing food, Does theology really change how you hand them a sandwich?
It changes everything about that interaction.
Really?
Velazquez breaks this down with ruthless clarity. He says, imagine a church that has a very narrow, individualistic theology of salvation. They view the entire gospel merely as an individual's transactional escape from hell.
Okay.
If that is their theological architecture, their entire mission will naturally become a numbers-driven sales pitch.
I see.
When a hungry person comes to them, the food is just bait. The human being is reduced to a metric, a target to be converted so the church can hit its quarterly numbers.
The person isn't treated with dignity, they're a project.
Exactly the opposite of the gospel. Conversely, Velazquez points out that if a church forgets the lordship of Christ over all of life, they might separate their evangelism from actual character formation.
What does that look like practically?
Well, they might preach grace on Sunday, but tolerate systemic injustice, racism, or exploitative labor practices in their own community on Monday.
Oh, wow.
Their thin theology allows them to ignore the real-world suffering of their neighbors. So theology isn't a distraction from practical work. It is the blueprint that ensures your practical work isn't doing psychological or spiritual harm.
A thin theology produces a thin mission. That explains so much about why certain massive, well-funded initiatives just collapse from the inside.
No, they have no load-bearing walls.
And this brings up his critique of the franchising model in modern ministry, doesn't it?
It's one of his most pointed critiques, actually. We see this massive trend where a megachurch in a major Western urban center, let's say Seattle or Dallas, develops a highly successful, slick, heavily produced operational model.
Right, and it works great there.
It works brilliantly in their context. But then leaders from a completely different environment, perhaps a rural agricultural town in the Philippines, decide to just copy and paste that exact model.
Oh, boy.
They import the lighting aesthetics, the specific musical style, the exact programmatic structure, assuming it is a guaranteed recipe for success.
And it completely fails, or at least it fails to bear any genuine, lasting roots.
It fails because it treats Christian mission like mass production instead of incarnation. Velazquez emphasizes that you cannot take a hyper-individualistic, consumer-driven coffee shop aesthetic from Seattle, drop it into a communal, deeply relational farming province in the Philippines, and expect it to resonate.
It's like speaking a different language.
It is. It completely ignores the unique, God-given identity of that local congregation, and it completely ignores the cultural realities of the people outside the doors.
Which brings us to a massive pivot in the book, because recognizing your own unique identity is only the first step. You also have to recognize the unique reality of the people you are actually trying to reach. You cannot just lock yourself in a room, define your theology, and then refuse to look out the window.
Yeah, that's just a monastery at that point.
Exactly. And this introduces Velazquez's concept of contextual intelligence.
This is where the manual shifts from the deeply theological to the hyper-tactical. Velazquez establishes that while the gospel is universal and eternal, ministry is always located somewhere.
Somewhere specific.
Exactly. It does not happen in an abstraction. It happens in a specific zip code, in a real neighborhood, populated by people who have real economic struggles, historical trauma, and ingrained cultural assumptions.
But how do you adapt a 2,000-year-old message to a modern, specific context without just watering it down to make it sound appealing? There is always that fear of compromising the truth just to get people in the door.
Velazquez points directly to the Apostle Paul to solve that tension. He takes the reader on a deep dive into Acts chapter 17 when Paul is in Athens.
Yeah.
Now, when Paul was operating in a Jewish synagogue, he reasoned from the Hebrew scriptures because his audience possessed that context.
Right. They knew the references.
When he steps into the Areopagus in Athens, dealing with Greek philosophers, he doesn't use the same script.
He pivots.
He completely pivots. He walks around the city. He observes their culture. He reads the inscriptions on their altars. He even quotes their own local pagan poets, like Epimenides, back to them. He begins exactly where his listeners are. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul writes about becoming all things to all people, so that by all possible means he might save some.
And you know, people misread that verse constantly.
Oh, all the time.
They think becoming all things to all people means having no spine. They think it means you just agree with whatever the culture says so they will like you.
A chameleon, basically.
Right. But Paul wasn't changing his core message. He was changing his vocabulary.
Yes.
It is the ultimate form of respect for your audience. It's doing the grueling intellectual work of translating an absolute truth into a cultural framework that the listener actually understands. I like to think about it like this. Imagine you are an engineer and you have invented the absolute best pair of snowshoes in human history.
Okay.
They are a flawless, brilliant product. But if you walk into the middle of the Sahara Desert and try to sell those snowshoes to nomadic tribes living in the sand, you are going to look like a lunatic.
And if they reject you, you can't blame them for being stubborn or blind.
Yeah.
You failed them. You did not read the context.
Exactly. You had a great product, but zero contextual intelligence. You refused to pay attention to the reality of the people standing right in front of you.
And Velazquez provides a rigorous framework to prevent leaders from selling snowshoes in the desert.
What does that look like?
He lays out a series of highly penetrating diagnostic questions that he insists any organization must ask before they launch a single strategy.
Hit me with...
First, who are the actual people God has placed before us? Not the demographic we wish lived here, not the wealthy donors we hope to attract, but who actually lives in a 2-mile radius of our building.
Ouch. That's a reality check.
It really is.
Yeah.
Second, what are their daily fears and economic constraints? If you launch a massive youth program that meets at 4 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, but you are in an agricultural community where every teenager is required to work the fields until sundown, your program will fail.
Right.
Not because the community doesn't care about youth, but because you lacked contextual intelligence.
You created a program for a phantom demographic.
Precisely. And his third diagnostic question goes deeper. What historical or social barriers do we need to address with patients? Is there a history of religious trauma in this specific city? Is there deep racial tension?
Wow.
He stresses that the act of mapping a community isn't just a sociological exercise, it is deeply pastoral. It forces leadership teams to take off their rose-colored glasses, stop copying other people's homework, and see the field as it actually exists.
Okay, so if we synthesize where we are so far, we know we cannot invent the mission. We have to tap into the pre-existing Missio Dei. We know we have to define our unique architectural identity so we have a foundation. And we know we have to develop contextual intelligence so we actually understand the terrain.
Exactly, that's the core.
But practically speaking, this brings us to a very harsh, unyielding reality. We only have 24 hours in a day.
Yeah, unfortunately.
An organization only has so many dollars in the bank account. You only have a finite number of volunteers who are willing to give up their Saturday mornings. How do we actually allocate those highly limited resources? And this leads us to what I think is the most ruthless but necessary concept in the entire manual stewardship.
It's entirely ruthless, but it's the only way an organization survives.
Yeah.
Velazquez pivots to the concept of resources, and he makes an observation that contradicts almost everything we hear in the nonprofit sector.
What's that?
He states that when churches or ministries collapse, it is very rarely because of a genuine lack of resources.
Wait, really?
The failure is almost always due to a massive misalignment of the resources they already possess.
That is a bold claim. Because if you talk to any nonprofit director or any pastor, their number one complaint is always, we don't have enough money and we don't have enough people.
They feel that way because their resources are spread a mile wide and an inch deep.
Ah.
To illustrate this, Velazquez breaks down the parable of the talents from the Gospel of Matthew. In the parable, a master gives different amounts of money talents to his servants and leaves. When he returns, he evaluates them.
Right.
The profound theological takeaway here is that the master's accountability is not based on possession. It is based entirely on faithful use.
Oh, that's good.
The issue isn't how much capital you were handed, it's what you produced with what you were given. Applied to modern institutions, a church might have a massive annual budget of $5 million and a roster of 2,000 volunteers.
Which sounds incredibly successful.
It sounds great. But if they are pouring that money and human energy into legacy habits, outdated programs from the 1990s that no longer bear fruit, or duplicating services that another organization down the street is already doing better, they are failing as stewards.
They're just maintaining the museum.
Exactly. They are taking the master's money and burying it in the dirt of their own nostalgia.
But let's walk this into an actual boardroom.
Okay.
Let's look at the actual mechanism of how this works, because anyone listening who has ever managed a budget or led a team is screaming right now.
Yeah.
In community work, every single need that walks through the door feels urgent. Every request for funding or volunteer help comes with a heartbreaking story. If someone stands up in a meeting and says, "We need to start a food pantry," how does a leader look at a genuinely good cause, a real human need, and say no without feeling like a heartless failure? How do you actually execute that without tearing the team apart?
This raises an important question,
Yeah.
and it is the exact emotional hurdle that burns most leaders out. Velasquez addresses this head-on with a mechanism he calls the spiritual discipline of saying no.
A spiritual discipline.
Yes. He argues that saying no in that boardroom is not an act of selfishness. It is the ultimate act of stewardship. He provides a rubric for the leadership team. When a new initiative is pitched, it must pass through the filters of identity and context.
Okay, the things we just talked about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Does this fit our specific architectural identity? Are we the best equipped people in this city to do this? Or is someone else already doing it better? Is our desire to start this program driven by a genuine calling, or is it driven by guilt?
Guilt is a terrible strategic planner.
It is the worst.
Mhm.
Velasquez argues that if your ministry has no boundaries, you will inevitably have a diluted impact. Bounded ministry, knowing exactly what you are not called to do, prevents burnout and ensures that your finite resources are concentrated like a laser where they can actually affect change.
That makes a lot of sense.
And again, he points back to the earthly ministry of Jesus to prove this. Jesus was surrounded by systemic poverty, Roman oppression, and rampant disease. He did not eradicate poverty in first-century Judea. He did not overthrow the corrupt political system. He operated in perfect, bounded obedience to the specific will of the Father.
We all suffer from this massive Messiah complex, don't we?
We really do.
We think if we don't fix every single problem we see, we're failing the universe. But even the actual Messiah didn't try to fix every single problem simultaneously. He had boundaries.
And recognizing those boundaries is precisely why Velasquez says strategic partnerships are not just nice ideas, they are mathematically vital.
Right. Because you can't do it all.
Exactly. If you practice the spiritual discipline of saying no to a good cause, it means you must trust others to do the things you are not called to do. No single organization can own the entire supply chain of human redemption.
That's a great phrase. The supply chain of human redemption.
Yeah, partnerships are the biblical solution to human limitation. One church might be incredibly gifted at localized one-on-one youth mentoring, while a secular NGO down the street has the massive logistical infrastructure for citywide food distribution.
Right.
Partnering allows them to unite their efforts without demanding uniformity. It expands the overall reach of the work without diffusing the specific purpose of the local church.
So it's an ecosystem. You don't have to be the roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. You just have to play your specific part brilliantly.
Perfectly said.
But this completely disrupts how we evaluate ourselves. If we are saying no to things that look impressive, and we are ignoring the traditional corporate benchmarks of success, like constant expansion and monopolizing the market, having the biggest building in town, how on earth do we measure if we are actually succeeding?
Yeah, it's tough when you throw away the old ruler.
If I'm a leader, how do I audit my organization to know I'm not just failing and making excuses by calling it bounded ministry?
That is the ultimate test of the mission's ministry mapping framework. Velasquez fundamentally redefines the metrics of organizational effectiveness. He notes that the modern metric for success in the church world has been entirely hijacked by Wall Street logic.
Wall Street logic, wow.
Yeah. We measure the square footage of the campus, the size of the annual operating budget, and the sheer volume of weekend attendance.
Just spreadsheets.
The spreadsheets, yeah. But Velasquez argues that the true measure of an organization's mission is not how much it does or how big it gets, but how faithfully it obeys.
Obedience over output.
Yeah.
That completely changes the scorecard.
It shatters the scorecard. He grounds this deep in the Old Testament prophets, who were dealing with a very ancient version of this exact same institutional arrogance.
Okay, give me an example.
He quotes 1 Samuel 15.22, where the prophet Samuel confronts King Saul. Saul has just won a battle and is performing all these massive, highly visible religious sacrifices, but he completely ignored God's actual instructions.
Right.
Samuel tells him, to obey is better than sacrifice. Velasquez also pulls from Hosea 6.6, where God says, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice.
Yeah.
God is looking at the nation of Israel, who are running this massive, busy, exhausting religious machine, and he essentially tells them, I am absolutely not impressed by your religious friction because it is entirely detached from fidelity to my heart.
Man. Measuring success purely by attendance or budget size is like going to the doctor for a full physical exam, and the doctor says, okay, to measure your health today, I want you to stand in the corner and see how loud you can yell.
Right.
So you scream at the top of your lungs, and the doctor looks at his clipboard and says, wow, incredible volume, you are in perfect health.
Yeah, exactly.
But they completely ignored your resting heart rate. They didn't check your blood pressure. They asked nothing about your nutrition or your sleep habits. They just measured how much noise you could generate.
And that noise is misleading.
A massive crowd and a huge budget might just mean you are incredibly talented at making noise, but structurally, your organization could be on the verge of massive internal heart failure.
That is a brilliant and honestly terrifying diagnosis of the modern landscape. So if we throw out the noise metrics, what is the actual mechanism for evaluation?
Right.
What does a spiritual audit look like in Velocis's framework? He replaces the corporate spreadsheet with diagnostic questions of profound spiritual substance. He demands that leaders ask, are the people in our organization actually becoming more like Christ in their private daily lives?
You can't put that on a pie chart.
No, you can't. Are new believers being actively, slowly discipled? Or are they just being counted as a statistic and ignored? When we interact with the poor in our community, are we serving them in a way that elevates their dignity? Or are we just using their poverty as a photo opportunity for our annual donor brochure?
That is a sharp question. Are we using people to build our brand, or are we using our brand to build people?
Exactly the tension he highlights. And his final metric for sustainability is perhaps the most difficult. Are the ministries you are building resilient enough to last beyond the charisma of a single, highly gifted leader?
Oof. That is the absolute Achilles heel of so many movements.
It really is.
The charismatic founder leaves or retires or has a moral failure, and the entire organization collapses overnight because it was built entirely on a personality cult, not on architectural identity.
Which is why Velazquez constantly emphasizes that true, lasting fruitfulness takes an immense amount of time. You cannot microwave a redwood tree.
No, you can't.
You have to be deeply rooted in your identity and intimately connected to your local context to produce anything of lasting value. He warns leaders that fast, flashy, skyrocketing numbers are very often a symptom of an unsustainable system.
Just a sugar crash waiting to happen.
Exactly. True sustainability in this framework is quiet. It is deeply resilient. It is structurally sound enough to impact a community over multiple generations, not just a few financial quarters.
This entire framework is an absolute paradigm shift. It forces you to stop looking at the spinning tires and start looking at the map. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to pull this out of the macro organizational level and speak directly to you listening right now. We have spent this time analyzing church leadership, NGOs, and massive strategic mapping because that is the context of Velazquez's incredible manual. But the physics of this framework apply directly to your own daily life, your career trajectory, and your personal calendar.
It really is universally applicable.
It is. Look at your own schedule this week. Are you exhausted right now? Because if you are perpetually burned out, you have to ask yourself, are you mistaking constant frantic motion for actual forward momentum?
Just making noise.
Exactly. Are you suffering from a lack of personal identity architecture? Have you spent years building the beautiful mahogany doors of your career, perfecting your public image and your resume, but completely forgotten to pour the concrete foundation of who you actually are behind closed doors?
Yeah, that foundation work is everything.
And perhaps the hardest question of all, are you burning out because you haven't mastered the spiritual, personal discipline of saying no to genuinely good things? Are you letting guilt drive your schedule, leaving you with absolutely no energy to say yes to the things you are actually called to do?
It is a framework that forces absolute honesty, whether you are managing an international relief mission in the Philippines or just trying to manage your own household's weekly schedule. It demands that we stop prioritizing the things that look impressive to the crowd and start prioritizing what is faithfully aligned with reality.
So what does this all mean for you tomorrow morning? I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something to challenge you as you go about your week.
Yeah.
If an outside consultant were to walk into your life today and they demanded full access to audit your calendar, your screen time, and your bank account, creating a literal, unedited map of how you deploy your life's finite resources, what would that map actually reveal?
That's a scary thought.
It is. Would it show a clear, coherent mission driven by a deep sense of identity? Or would it just expose a chaotic, reactionary collection of inherited habits, societal pressures, and a desperate, exhausting fear of missing out? Remember the river. You do not have to stand on the dry bank and exhaust yourself trying to invent the current. The current is already moving. You just have to figure out who you are, build your boat, and learn how to align yourself with the water.
That's the real work.
It is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take that map, take a hard look at your resources, and we will see you next time.